Welcome back to the deep dive. So let's talk about Christopher Columbus.
Mm.
For a lot of us, I think the story we were taught in school was pretty simple. It was, this heroic tale.
The daring Genoese captain.
Right, exactly. In 1492, he sails the ocean blue, proves the world is round, which, by the way, we should just say up front, people had known for centuries.
A long, long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that part of the myth is particularly persistent.
But he bravely sails west, discovers a new continent, and gets himself a federal holiday and a place in the history books. It was a very neat, tidy story.
It was a perfect foundational story for a new nation. But that tidy narrative, the one that, like you said, was taught to generations of Americans is, well, it's fundamentally flawed.
Flawed seems like a gentle word for it.
It is. It's built on a staggering amount of misinformation, and I think most critically, it actively hides a really catastrophic historical reality.
A reality rooted in violence.
Violence, exploitation, and just a complete demographic collapse. And we know this because we've spent time with sources. We have Columbus's own journals, we have diplomatic letters, and maybe most damning of all, we have the eyewitness accounts from people who were right there with him.
Okay, so let's unpack this. That's our mission for this deep dive, really. To get past the myth and engage directly with those facts, with what the sources actually say.
Right.
We want to analyze the raw evidence of what happened during his 4 voyages. That's 1492, 1493, 1498, and 1502.
And when you do that, when you look the specific actions taken, suddenly all the controversy around Columbus Day, it starts to make a lot of sense.
The calls to replace it with Indigenous Peoples Day become, well, completely rational. The whole conflict seems to lie in what part of history we choose to focus on.
Precisely. So let's start with the biggest myth of all, the one we just touched on, the idea of discovery.
Right. He didn't discover America.
Not even remotely. The sources are absolutely definitive on this. There were millions of indigenous peoples representing hundreds of distinct, complex nations who had been thriving in the Americas for millennia.
And we're not talking about a few thousand years.
No, no. The conservative archaeological estimates put human habitation somewhere between 14,000 and 45,000 years before Columbus arrived. This was not an empty land.
And in the Caribbean specifically, where he actually landed, the population was huge.
It was immense. The estimates, they vary, but scholars suggest that for the Taíno and Arawak populations alone, we're talking about a conservative number of around 2 million people.
Wow, 2 million.
And some estimates go as high as 6 or even 12 million people flourishing across those islands. These were not primitive tribes in an empty wilderness. They were complex societies.
So that's the who he found.
Yeah.
But there's also the where. He was completely lost, wasn't he?
He was fundamentally wrong about where he was.
Right.
Absolutely. He wasn't looking for a new world. He was trying to get to the East Indies.
To China and India.
Yes. He was searching for a profitable Western sea route to get to Asia. And his certainty in his mistake was so profound that he called the people he met Indians.
A name that has stuck for 500 years, based on a geographical era.
A complete misnomer, based on this delusion that he had landed in Southeast Asia. And we should add, it was a delusion he held on to until the day he died.
And for anyone listening, just to be crystal clear about the geography of the United States, he never set foot here.
Never. Not once. His landfalls were all in the Caribbean. First in the Bahamas, on an island the natives called Guanahani, which he renamed San Salvador.
Then Cuba and Hispaniola.
Exactly. The island that's now shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. That was the center of his operations.
Which brings us to another fascinating point from the sources. He wasn't even the first non-native to get there.
Right. This is another layer to debunking the discovery myth. His voyages had the biggest impact, without a doubt. They changed the world. But he was not the first.
We all know about the Vikings, right?
We do. And we have solid archaeological evidence for it. Viking explorers, people like Leif Erikson, they set up settlements in Greenland and, critically, in Newfoundland, Canada.
And this was centuries earlier.
Centuries. We're talking around the 11th century, so a good 400 plus years before Columbus.
So that alone changes the context. He's not this singular pioneering figure. He's just the latest in a line of arrivals.
A very late arrival, in fact. And some sources point to even earlier potential contact. There are academic theories, and these are still debated, but they suggest Afro-Phoenician voyagers might have reached Central America around 750 BC.
Wow, 750 BC.
And there's more recent scholarship discussing West African mariners potentially reaching the Caribbean in the 14th and 15th centuries, just before Columbus.
The sources mention something specific here, the guanine spear points. Can you explain what those were? Because that detail seems really significant.
It's a fascinating piece of evidence. So, guanine was an alloy of gold, silver, and copper. And the specific composition of these spear points that Columbus's men found in Haiti was consistent with alloys being used by metallurgists in West Africa at the time.
So not something the Tainos were making themselves.
It seems not. And here's the crucial part. The sources say that when the Spanish asked the Taino where these came from, the natives told them they got them from black traders who came from the south and east.
So there was already a trade network.
It strongly suggests that yes, that the Taino were already part of a pre-Columbian oceanic trade network. So while we might not have definitive proof of sustained contact, that small piece of metal makes Columbus truly a latecomer, a disruptive force, not an initiator.
Okay, so we've put the geography and the chronology to rest. Now we have to talk about the motivation. Why was he there? The schoolbook story is about, what, spices and glory?
Spices, glory, trade, it's a very sanitized version. The sources reveal a much more intense, complex, and religiously charged motivation driving not just Columbus, but his royal backers.
You have to understand the context of Spain in 1492.
Exactly. It's the most important year in their history. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella had just completed the Reconquista. They expelled the last of the Muslim rulers from Granada.
So the country was filled with this religious zeal.
An incredible amount of religious fervor and national ambition. And right at that moment, Columbus comes along, and he's promising not just wealth, but a way to glorify God and expand the influence of the Catholic Church.
And this wasn't just some symbolic gesture. His contract, the deal he struck with the crown, it shows just how ambitious and, frankly, how demanding he was.
Oh, his demands were extreme for the time. He insisted on a noble title admiral of the Ocean Sea. He wanted to be viceroy and governor of any lands he found.
And then there was the money.
He demanded and he received a 10% commission on all riches.
10% of everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
Gold, pearls, spices, and slaves.
Yeah.
It's right there in the contract. And you have to see what that does. It immediately creates an incentive for maximum, rapid extraction of wealth, no matter the human cost.
And the gold, specifically the gold. It wasn't just to make the Spanish crown wealthy. It was tied to this almost apocalyptic vision Columbus had.
Precisely. This is something people often miss. Columbus's personal writings, especially a book he compiled called the Libro de las Profecías, the Book of Prophecies.
What was it?
He laid out his belief that the enormous amounts of gold he was going to find were necessary to fund one last massive crusade.
A crusade to do what?
To retake Jerusalem from the Muslims. He believed this was a required step, a biblical prerequisite for the second coming of Christ.
So every ounce of gold he was looking for wasn't just currency. It was, in his mind, fuel for a holy war.
It puts the whole expedition in a completely different light. It wasn't about trade. From the very beginning, the entire venture, which he himself called La Empresa, the enterprise, was a mission of conquest.
An enterprise. A business venture.
A business venture of conquest and exploitation. All of it anchored equally in this profound religious fervor and, of course, ruthless personal ambition. If you understand La Empresa, you understand the brutality that followed almost immediately.
And that brutality, that transition from a divine mission to human subjugation, it begins the second his ships land in the Bahamas in October 1492.
Yes. Let's look at that initial encounter with the Lucayan, Taíno, and Arawak peoples. Because the contrast between what Columbus wrote that he saw and what he immediately started planning it's deeply unsettling.
What did he see at first?
He saw profound hospitality. His own journal describes the natives as, and I'm quoting here, so naive and so free with their possessions that no one who has not witnessed them would believe it.
So they were generous.
Incredibly generous. They brought the Spaniards food. They shared everything they had. They saw the arrival of these strange, bearded men as something to be met with openness.
And the other primary accounts, like the ones from the Spanish priest, Bartolomé de las Casas, they paint a picture of a really unique, peaceful society.
They do. Las Casas described the Taíno as well-built, mostly young under 30, and living in these large communal structures.
And their entire concept of ownership was different.
Completely different. They operated outside of these Western European ideas of commerce and private property. Las Casas noted they lived in these huge communal buildings, sometimes with up to 600 people inside.
Wow.
And they had a different social structure. He wrote, "They chose their mates and left them as they pleased, without offense, jealousy, or anger." They just didn't get the idea of commercial value. They'd happily trade bits of gold for what the Spanish considered junk.
Like glass beads and hockle bells.
Worthless trinkets, exactly. But this openness, this generosity was immediately seen as a weakness.
Columbus weaponized it.
Instantly, within hours of seeing this, he had already decided their fate. The moment he planted the Spanish flag on the beach, a symbolic act of claiming the land for Spain, he wrote in his journal that he took the natives by force.
Just like that.
Just like that. That single act set the precedent for everything that followed. He immediately began assessing the Taino, not as potential partners, but for their utility to la empresa.
What did he write about them?
The journal entries are chilling in how calculated they are. He noted they should be good servants and very intelligent. He also wrote they were very meek and without knowledge of evil, nor do they kill others or steal.
So he sees that they're peaceful, and his first thought is good servants.
Yes. He then describes them as without weapons and so timid that one of our people can put 100 of them to flight. This wasn't an observation about a potential ally. It was a military assessment of an easy target.
And that leads to the infamous quote.
The infamous, dark conclusion to his assessment. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. The plan for conquest wasn't a reaction to any Taino aggression. There was none. It was the immediate conclusion he drew from their peaceful nature.
And he didn't wait long to act on this plan for these good servants.
No, he wasted no time at all. Just 2 days after landing, on October 14, 1492, he's already writing in his journal that they could all be carried off to Castile or be held captive in the island itself.
The idea of enslavement was there from the first 48 hours.
It was, and it escalated from an idea to an action very quickly. By November 11th, he was actively kidnapping people.
The sources mention 5 young men.
Yes, he forcibly seized 5 young male natives to take back to Spain. The official reason was to teach them Spanish, so they could be translators. But the real intent was to display them like trophies, to show potential investors the human resources available.
And this quickly devolved into sexual slavery as well.
It did. The sources recount that a bit later he seized 7 women and 3 children. And the language he uses is horrifying. He refers to them as cabezas de mujeres, 7 head of women.
Head, like cattle.
It's the language one uses for counting livestock. It shows you the level of dehumanization that had already taken place in his mind.
And why did he take the women and children? Was there a strategy behind it?
A very cynical one. He noted in his journal that taking them would keep the male captives docile in their slavery. It was a deliberate tactic to break their spirit by holding their families hostage.
A Spanish historian later called this a great abuse.
Yes, a most lamentable precedent. An act that seemed small at the time, but would have, in his words, fatal consequences.
And tragically, this became standard practice.
It did. Columbus himself, in a letter from 1500, talks about how girls as young as 9 or 10 years old are in demand by his men. So the foundation for absolute human degradation was laid within weeks of that first landing, under his direct orders.
So that's the first voyage. When he comes back for the second voyage in 1493, things get even more systematic.
They do. The second voyage is when the initial acts of kidnapping and subjugation turn into a full-blown system of tyranny. When he returned, he found the first settlement he'd left, La Navidad, had been destroyed.
Why was it destroyed?
Mostly because of the violence of the Spanish men he left behind. They had been attacking the natives, which ramped up tensions considerably. So Columbus establishes a new colony, La Isabela, and at that point he drops any pretense of peaceful trade.
And he implements the system of forced labor.
Full-scale forced labor. The economic engine of the colony was something called the tribute system.
Right. And this was designed to just extract as much wealth as possible.
As quickly as possible. It imposed this incredibly strict and ultimately impossible demand on the Taino people.
So how did it work?
Every native person over the age of 14, living in the gold-rich areas of Hispaniola, was required to pay a tribute every 3 months.
And the tribute was gold.
A specific amount of gold dust. They had to fill a hollow cascabel.
What's a casca bell?
It's a hawk's bell. Think of a small bell about the size of a fist or a small orange. They had to fill that with gold dust every 3 months.
That sounds like a staggering amount of gold for people who didn't have mining tools.
It was an impossible amount. And for the Taino who lived far from the gold fields, they had a different quota. They had to provide 25 pounds in a roba of spun cotton.
And how did they enforce this?
Through terror. If a native met their quota, they were given a small metal disc to wear around their neck as proof of payment. If you're caught by a Spaniard and you didn't have your token,
What happened?
the punishments were immediate and barbaric.
The priest, Bartolomé de las Casas, he saw this system up close. He initially admired Columbus, but this changed his mind.
Completely. The cruelty he witnessed turned him into the greatest advocate for indigenous rights of his era. He called the tribute system impossible and intolerable.
He knew it was a setup for failure.
He knew it. He understood that gold was actually quite scarce in those streams. The Taino weren't miners. The system was designed to ensure they would always fail, which meant they would always be subject to punishment. It fixed, in his words, the yoke of servitude upon the island.
It was designed to keep them in a permanent state of fear.
And subjugation, yes.
The accounts from Las Casas about the atrocities, they're essential to understanding what happened, but they're very hard to read.
They are vital for historical honesty. He described how the Spaniards grew more conceited every day, how they refused to even walk, insisting on being carried on the backs of Indians.
And he documented the casual cruelty.
Unbelievable, casual cruelty. He wrote that soldiers would test their swords and their manly strength on captured Indians and place bets on the slicing off of heads or cutting of bodies in half with one blow.
Just for sport.
For sport.
Yeah.
And the official punishment for failing the gold quota is one of the most chilling details in the entire historical record.
This is the cutting off of hands.
Yes. Those who failed to deliver their tribute would have their hands cut off, and they'd be left to bleed to death. And sometimes the severed hands were hung around the victim's neck.
Why?
They were sent back to their villages with the instruction to go now, carry the message to others who might be hiding or thinking of resisting. It was psychological warfare.
And some of this torture was given a kind of religious justification.
A perverse one. Las Casas described the use of gallows, where the Spanish would hang victims in groups of 13.
13.
In memory of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles. And then they would light a fire underneath them and burn them alive. It was this grotesque fusion of unimaginable cruelty and Christian symbolism.
Las Casas summed it up pretty bluntly.
He did. He wrote, "Our work was to exasperate, ravage, kill, mangle, and destroy." And he confirmed, "I saw here cruelty on a scale no living being has ever seen or expects to see."
And of course, this level of barbarity was only possible because of the huge technological advantage the Spanish had.
An immense advantage. Steel swords, armor, crossbows, horses, firearms. And when the Taino tried to resist the tribute system, Columbus brought out his most terrifying weapon.
The war dogs.
The war dogs. Spanish greyhounds and mastiffs, specifically trained to hunt and kill humans. Las Casas wrote that because the natives were, in his words, nude from head to foot, these dogs could tear 100 Indians to pieces in an hour. They were instruments of mass slaughter and terror.
And Columbus used them in a major campaign in 1495.
He did. After the Taino mounted some resistance, he led a massive retaliation campaign. He used the dogs, crossbows, and guns against what the sources called defenseless Indians. The victory was so total that Columbus's own son, Ferdinand, later wrote that the rout was thanks to His Divine Majesty's hand.
Again, framing a massacre as a sign of God's favor.
It was a constant theme.
The sources also describe these heartbreaking, desperate attempts by the Taino to fight back.
They tried. They realized how powerful the Spanish war horses were, so they started digging pits on the roads and filling them with sharp, fire-hardened sticks, hoping to impale the horses through their unarmored bellies.
Did it work?
Not for long. Once the Spanish figured out this tactic, their retaliation was just unspeakably cruel. They would capture Taino, including children and pregnant women, and throw them into the very same pits to be impaled on the sticks.
My God, the psychological effect of all this must have been devastating.
It was. The cruelty led to mass suicides among the Arawaks. The sources tragically describe mothers poisoning their own infants with manioc root just to spare them from the horrors of living under Spanish rule.
And the result of all this, the murder, the forced labor, the suicides, was a demographic collapse.
A terrifyingly rapid one. Remember those estimates of millions of people in Hispaniola in 1492?
Yes.
By 1515, so just over 20 years later, there were maybe 50,000 left. By 1550, barely 500. And by 1650, the Arawak people and their direct descendants on Hispaniola were completely gone, wiped out.
That is the literal definition of genocide.
It is.
And it's really important here to push back against the narrative that this was all just, disease. That's the story we often hear, that it was an accidental tragedy.
And that is a crucial distinction to make. Yes, European diseases, smallpox, influenza were devastating. The Taino had no immunity. But the sources are crystal clear that the primary drivers of this collapse were the direct actions of the Spanish.
So murder, forced labor.
Direct murder. systemic forced labor that worked people to death, and widespread famine. The tribute system forced everyone to search for gold, so no one was left to cultivate the crops, especially their staple, manioc. So they starved. The disease was like gasoline on a fire that Columbus himself had set.
There's one story of resistance that really stands out in the sources, the story of the cacique Hatui in Cuba.
Hatui is an incredible figure. He had fled from Hispaniola to Cuba, so he knew what the Spanish were capable of. He tried to warn the people there.
And he understood their motivation perfectly.
He did. He recognized it wasn't about God or honor, it was about greed. He told his followers to gather all their gold and jewels and throw them into the river. He literally called the gold the god of the Christians, and he believed if they got rid of it, maybe the Spanish would leave them alone.
He was eventually captured and sentenced to be burned at the stake.
He was. And right before they lit the fire, a Franciscan friar offered him a last chance at salvation. Convert to Christianity, he said, and your soul will go to heaven.
And Hatui's response is just. It's one of the most powerful statements in history.
It is. He asked the friar a simple question. Do Christians go to heaven? The friar said yes, of course they do. And Hatui immediately replied that in that case, he would prefer to go to hell.
He would rather face eternal damnation than spend another minute in the company of such cruel men.
That single exchange tells you everything you need to know about the depth of revulsion the indigenous people felt for their conquerors.
Okay, so this demographic collapse, the genocide of the Taíno, created a very practical problem for La Empresa.
A huge problem.
Yeah.
A labor shortage.
The gold mines and the new sugar plantations, they needed workers.
They needed a constant supply of backbreaking labor. And that necessity leads us directly to the creation of the largest system of forced migration in human history.
The transatlantic slave trade?
It's a direct line, and Columbus initiated it. In February 1494, on his second voyage, he sent the first shipment of enslaved people back to Spain, several dozen Taínos.
And he saw this as a business opportunity.
A very profitable one. He wrote that they were well-made and of very good intelligence, and even suggested that taxing the shipments of human beings could be a way to financially stabilize the whole colonial project.
And he scaled this up very quickly.
Incredibly fast. In 1495, he ordered a massive roundup of 1,600 Taínos. He selected 550 of what he called the best males and females, chained them, and shipped them to Spain.
And the rest, the other 1,000 people.
He simply turned them over to the Spanish settlers to take, in his words, as many as he pleased. So he wasn't just centralizing the slave trade for the crown, he was decentralizing it, normalizing it for every colonist on the island.
But this indigenous slave trade, it wasn't very efficient from their cruel perspective.
No, it wasn't. The Taínos, they were traumatized, malnourished. Many of them died on the horrific transatlantic voyage. Many more died soon after arriving in Spain. The climate, the diseases. They were, as one source says, unfitted for the land.
But Columbus didn't stop.
Despite the high death rate, his mercenary logic was unshaken. He wrote a letter saying, "Let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold."
But there was some pushback, even from the Spanish monarchy. Queen Isabella.
Yes, this is an interesting and complex part of the story. When Columbus sent her a gift of 500 slaves, she was reportedly horrified, and she sternly ordered them returned.
So she was against slavery.
Not exactly. Her objection was very specific and legalistic. She believed the Taíno were now subjects of the Spanish crown, and under Spanish law, you could not enslave your own subjects.
So it was a legal issue, not a moral one about the act of slavery itself.
Precisely. Her outrage was symbolic, and it was limited only to the Taíno. It didn't stop the system of forced labor on the island, and critically, it didn't stop the search for other people to enslave who weren't her subjects.
Which is the pivot point.
It's the pivot point. The indigenous population was almost gone, and Isabella had complicated using the few who were left, so the crown had to look elsewhere for labor.
And the historian Basil Davidson calls Columbus the father of the slave trade for this very reason.
He does, because the very first official license to send enslaved Africans directly to the Caribbean was issued in 1501, while Columbus was still the governor of the territory. The solution to the labor crisis he created was the African slave trade.
Why the specific shift to Africans? What was the justification?
It was a cruel mix of theology, emerging racial science, and cold, hard economics. At first, the Spanish had to rely on Portugal, which already had a slaving infrastructure on the coast of West Africa. The justifications were things like, we're saving their souls through conversion, or they used twisted biblical interpretations like the curse of Ham to sanction it.
But the real reason was much simpler.
The real reason was sugar.
The commodity.
The commodity. Sugar was exploding in popularity in Europe, replacing honey. It was becoming a massive industry. But cultivating sugarcane is incredibly arduous, brutal work, especially in a tropical climate. They needed a cheap, durable, and easily replaceable labor force.
And they developed this racist theory that Africans were better suited for it.
They did. They believed that because Africans came from similar tropical climates, they would be physically stronger and more resistant to diseases than the Taíno had been.
And this belief led to the formalization of the trade.
It led to the Asiento de Negros contracts, which started in 1518. These were basically government-sanctioned monopolies, licenses granted to private traders to transport huge numbers of enslaved Africans to the Americas. This system created the industrial scale of the transatlantic slave trade, all to solve the labor crisis that started with Columbus.
For all his skill as a navigator, it seems Columbus was just an awful administrator, a brutal one.
Abysmal, and his chaotic, violent rule eventually led to his own downfall, even in his own time. He angered everyone.
Not just the indigenous peoples.
No, he angered his own Spanish colonists. His rule led to bloody revolts from Taino rebels and from disgruntled Spaniards who complained to the crown about his mismanagement and the cruelty of him and his brothers.
And the crown eventually listened.
They did. By 1500, they'd had enough. Columbus was arrested on charges of mismanagement, and he was sent back to Spain in chains.
In chains.
In chains. And I think that's a really important fact.
Right.
It shows that his actions were considered extreme and controversial even by his own sovereigns, long before any modern reassessment of his legacy.
Even the Catholic missionaries on the island were complaining about him.
Yes, they accused Columbus and his administration of getting in the way of their efforts to convert the natives. They said he clearly cared more about getting slaves than creating Christians.
So this all raises a really important question. How should we view him today?
It's the central question, isn't it? The sources paint him as this deeply paradoxical figure. He was, without a doubt, a brilliant navigator, a visionary explorer who changed the course of world history. But he was an utterly incapable governor who defaulted to horrific violence whenever his leadership failed.
You often hear the argument that he was just a man of his time, that it's unfair to judge him by our modern standards.
You do hear that. But that argument kind of falls apart when you realize his own contemporaries, people like Queen Isabella and Bartolomé de las Casas, were already documenting and condemning his exceptional cruelty. These things were seen as horrific even by the violent standards of the 15th century.
And how do Native American scholars see him?
They are, for the most part, unequivocal. They classify him as a savage who initiated a genocide that has never truly been reckoned with. So no matter how you frame it, the violence, the slavery, the destruction, it's all there, documented by the people who saw it with their own eyes.
And this documented historical truth is really the heart of the modern fight over Columbus Day.
It is. It's a direct conflict between celebrating a national myth of discovery and confronting a historical horror that set the stage for centuries of racial injustice in the Americas.
The holiday itself, it actually has a fairly recent history in the U.S.
Surprisingly recent. It was celebrated here and there starting in 1792 for the 300th anniversary, but it really took off in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it became a rallying point for Irish and especially for Italian Catholic immigrants.
Why did Italian immigrants specifically embrace him?
It was about ethnic pride and assimilation. You have to remember, this is a time when Italian immigrants faced a lot of discrimination in America. So celebrating Columbus, a Genoese Italian who they could frame as the first great European hero in American history, it was a powerful way for them to stake their own claim to being American.
And then FDR made it official.
President Franklin Delano Roosevelt made it a national federal holiday in 1937, partly as a political move to court the growing Italian-American vote. And it remains one of only 3 federal holidays that celebrates a single individual.
Washington and Martin Luther King Jr. being the others.
Correct. And as the critics always point out, the holiday itself is just based on so many factual errors. We're honoring an Italian man who sailed for Spain, who never landed on the U.S. mainland, and who served the Spanish crown, not America. It is, as one native scholar put it, offensive, embarrassing, and completely absurd.
The push to change this has been going on for a long time.
For decades. The first formal call to action by indigenous people was at a United Nations conference way back in 1977. For them, the holiday isn't just a party. It's a celebration of colonization, genocide, and the erasure of their history and their truth.
It seems to validate a very dangerous idea.
A deeply offensive one. The idea that an entire race of people can lose their land, their sovereignty, their very human rights simply because another race discovered them. Celebrating that day reinforces the idea that indigenous lives and cultures are somehow secondary to the American story.
So the argument for replacing it with Indigenous Peoples Day, or IPD, is about affirming it was already here.
Exactly. It's a shift that recognizes the reality that indigenous peoples were here first, that they have rich histories, vibrant cultures, and complex political systems that are thousands of years old.
And the sources mention this term, survivance.
Yes, survivance is a key concept in Native American studies. It doesn't just mean survival. It means survival plus active resistance, resilience, and the continuation of culture in the face of incredible pressure. IPD is about commemorating that survivance, not the arrival of the colonizer.
It's really a demand for education, forcing the country to look at the real history of its founding.
A history founded on stolen land and systemic disenfranchisement. Yes.
And this movement has picked up a lot of steam recently.
An incredible amount of momentum, especially in the last few years. The national conversation we're having about public monuments and historical memory, propelled by movements like Black Lives Matter, has led to real institutional change.
We've seen Columbus statues coming down all over the country.
Toppled or removed in places like Boston, Chicago, and many others. And that cultural shift is being followed by legal changes.
Right, so cities, states, universities.
Many of them are making the change. Berkeley was one of the first, but now you have Minneapolis, Seattle, Portland, Phoenix. And entire states like Vermont and Minnesota have officially replaced Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day.
There's also a psychological argument here that I think is really important and often gets missed.
It's critical. The sources highlight the psychological harm that celebrating Columbus Day causes for Native American children. It contributes to a sense of alienation and discrimination.
And Native youth already face such high rates of suicide and other negative outcomes.
Exactly. So to have a national holiday that valorizes a man who's documented as a murderer, a rapist, and a slave trader of their ancestors, it directly attacks their sense of self-worth and their place in this country.
So when people ask, why can't we just celebrate both? Why does it have to be a replacement? The sources have a pretty clear answer.
A very clear and unequivocal answer. You cannot celebrate indigenous peoples while at the same time celebrating their murder and dehumanization. The two holidays are fundamentally incompatible.
One celebrates the beginning of colonization, the other celebrates the resistance to it.
Precisely. To celebrate both is to celebrate a contradiction. It doesn't work.
And Indigenous leaders argue this is still so urgent because the old sanitized history is still being taught.
It is. So many textbooks still just tiptoe around the truth. They'll say the Taíno population collapsed because of epidemics, and they'll completely ignore the explicit role of forced labor and mass murder. They'll focus on the Columbian exchange as if it were just a happy trading of potatoes and horses.
This kind of sanitized history justifies just keeping things as they are.
It does. And that's why advocates for IPD see it as more than just a name change. It's a necessary first step toward real recognition, reconciliation, and equity. It's about finally telling the truth.
The truth that Columbus initiated both the Indigenous American Genocide and the transatlantic slave trade.
And they argue that replacing the holiday has to be backed up by real, tangible action. Action that recognizes the continued existence and contributions of living indigenous communities today.
Communities that are still fighting for their rights.
Still fighting for federal recognition, for their land back, for compensation, for justice. The point of IPD is to move beyond symbolism and use the day to celebrate indigenous survival, resilience, and sovereignty right now in the present day.
So to wrap this all up, what does our deep dive today really mean? We've traced this story from Columbus's religiously fueled quest for gold.
A quest to fund a crusade, yeah.
Which immediately devolved into a system of brutal exploitation. This culminated in a documented genocide against the peaceful Taíno and Arawak peoples, and critically, it set the precedent for racial slavery in the Americas.
The core conflict today, it really isn't about one man or one statue. It's about a nation's integrity. It's a choice between celebrating a comfortable fictional myth of discovery or finally embracing the difficult, loaded truth of resilience and survival.
The 4 voyages of Columbus established the template.
They established the tragic, foundational template of conquest and resource extraction that Western conquerors would follow for the next 5 centuries. It was the moment these two worlds collided, with devastatingly final results.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to consider.
The sources, especially Las Casas, described the Taíno as a people who had almost no concept of private ownership or commerce. He wrote that what belonged to one belonged to all.
A culture based on communal sharing.
Exactly. So think about the profound total shockwave that was created when that culture, based on generosity, encountered an armed culture based entirely on maximal personal accumulation of gold, of slaves, of land. The collision wasn't just ships meeting ashore, it was two completely antithetical worldviews clashing. So the question is, what might our world look like today if Columbus had chosen to honor the generosity he saw in those first few days, instead of immediately plotting how to subjugate it?